everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. What we're going to be talking about today is what's in a name. We focused on this idea of what's in a name before. I'm going to put links down below so that you can connect to some older videos from last year regarding reparations and identity. So we're going to be looking at what's in a claim related to ADOS and DACS, and we're going to talk about disaggregation of legal claims. Based upon commentary and some additional videos that have been reviewing the topic of reparations, the topic of ADOS, and that identity, there is a need to better clarify what we are talking about when we're talking about ADOS or DACS. And what we're going to try to do here is to start to talk about aligning this idea of ADOS or DACS to the idea of reparations for a specific class of people who would be potentially entitled to reparations. And so there are many people who have in their minds, in their individual minds, different ideas about the criteria for reparations, different standards, different ideas about who the people should and should not be, and how reparations should be provided. And so we're going to start off with this initial discussion, basically parsing the meaning of ADOS and DACS, and see if we can come together and start to think more clearly about an actual class that is actually tied to reparations. Now, I do want to point out that many of the videos are going to be transferred to another channel that's going to be focusing on ancestry and legacy. And there's also a Patreon channel. The videos are free, but it's on Patreon. However, there will also be a YouTube channel that's going to be started that's going to focus on specifically these issues, because this channel is primarily for psychology and law. And we want to keep it open for a variety of topics. But for right now, we're going to keep it right here. And just a reminder for now, if this video appears anywhere other than Dr. Tracey McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. And what you see on the screen is a depiction of the people back in the 30s in the boot heel. These were sharecroppers who were denied their right to the income related to their sharecropping. There was an allotment that was paid to the farmers, and they were supposed to distribute it to the sharecroppers, and it came from the federal government. They did not do that. And so what you see are the people who were living out on the road, and they were out on the road in protest. And so what you're going to see are depictions along the way through this particular video. I'm going to do a separate video on this particular issue. This is related to Jim Crow, and it is related to reparations, and it's a very specific class of people. Okay, so you can see on the screen that we have a variety of opinions. These are comments coming from a variety of directions regarding people's individual understandings of reparations and of this class known as ADOS now. And so you have individuals who are making all sorts of assertions about what needs to happen, and these are their individual opinions. Now, at some point in time, that definition, that understanding of that class is going to have to be significantly tightened, and it's going to have to be directly related to the harm that is being alleged. And so it can't be loosey-goosey. It can't be, all black people. It can't be all African Americans. It really needs to be tightened up. And so we're going to be talking about that a little further. But right now, let's just quickly look at some of the thoughts that people have. One individual is saying that ADOS entitlement should only be related to people who are descended from a black woman's lineage. And so if the child did not come through the woman, the child's not entitled to reparations. There are other comments that say the same thing with males. And so this is just a flip of that. You have some individuals who are bringing up the issue of there being different types of slavery. And so when you just say descendants of slavery, it could be anybody who was enslaved during that time period. So that's another concern that's brought up. Another one is that some individuals are saying that this needs to be related to Africa. versus America. And so you have, we are actually American descendants of enslaved Africans, and they want to change it from ADOS to ADOEA. Then you have another individual who brings up criteria from Dr. Darity and Frank. What they're saying is that there should be two criteria, one related to being a descendant of someone who was specifically enslaved in the United States, and then another criteria where the individual has to have been identifying as Black or African American or Negro for the past 10 years. And so you can see people are all over the place, and there is a need to tighten things up a little bit and start to have those discussions about tightening things up. It doesn't have to be, set in stone, but those discussions do need to occur. And I just want to clarify something. Some people think that affirmative action served as reparations, or welfare serves as reparations, or that reparations constitutes a handout. And so I want to clarify something right now. Reparations is not a handout. Reparations and welfare are not synonymous. And affirmative action, the way that it has been constructed, is also not reparations. And so we are not talking about Executive Order 10925 or subsequent orders. We are talking about, in this instance, reparations. And we're going to go over at the end what reparations actually is, because there are a lot of misunderstandings, and a lot of people have this erroneous belief that reparations is related to a handout. And so we're going to clarify that. And here you have a little person sitting out on the road in the boot heel back in the 30s. And let's quickly go over this definition of ADOS. So this is the preliminary one. We're going to do a preliminary one for DACS also. So let's just look at the basic words that we're talking about in this particular acronym here. And so we have American descendant of slavery. That's ADOS, or some people might say American descendants of slaves, but this is primarily American descendant of slavery. And next we have a variant, which is DACS. To be clear, in terms of YouTubers, Seren uses DACS and Yvette Carnell uses ADOS. And so this actually tightens up ADOS, by the way. So Seren's understanding is that it is descendant of American chattel slavery. And so there is a specific type of slavery that Seren is talking about. And here you can see another depiction of some of these sharecroppers who were out on the road in the 30s. All right, and so let's now parse ADOS first. And so we've got American descendant of slavery. And so basically what this particular definition is saying is that an American, which means basically a citizen, here's the thing about that. It means born or naturalized. So we're talking about a citizen of the United States of America, or a citizen of any sovereign in the Americas. When you use American just by itself, American does relate to the country, United States of America, but it also relates to the Americas. And so this may be an area where that definition needs to be tightened up. This is not to say that you have to change from ADOS or from DACS. It's just saying that the understanding of what an American is needs to be tightened. Then you have descendant. Descendant basically is lineal ancestor, offspring. It's not, there's not that much variety to that. Of means related to or from. So an American who is an offspring of or from or related to. Slavery. And so slavery is just basically bondage, captivity, servitude, serfdom, oppression. And so you need to also tighten that up. So that needs to be tightened up. What type of slavery are people talking about? Okay, so on the flip, you have DACS, and DACS is descendant of American chattel slavery. And so the thing that has been added here, so you still have the same, concerns in terms of what needs to be tightened. But here you have chattel slavery. And so chattel slavery is not just slavery where you have, you're in bondage. You're actually a piece of property. And so you actually belong to the person like a piece of personal property, sort of like your handbag or your suitcase or your car, things like that. And so that's what chattel slavery was about. And so that's different from indentured servitude or even other types of slavery where you were not considered a piece of property that could be bought and sold. And here you see another young person sitting out on the road in the boot heel in the 30s. And now we're going to look at some potential clarifications to tighten up that understanding. Again, this is not the end-all be-all. This is a part of an ongoing discussion, and everyone should be basically having these discussions. It doesn't matter whether you are a descendant of American slavery or an American descendant of slavery or a descendant of chattel slavery. Everyone should be having this discussion because this is a discussion that involves the United States. It involves America. It involves the world. And so it's not a discussion that is closed off to other people. But in terms of defining the class, it would really need to be limited to those who are members of the class. If other people from other classes want to define themselves, they are free to do so. But we're focusing on ADOS and DACS at this time. And you can see two individuals in the boot heel out on the road with the other sharecroppers back in the 30s. All right, so let's quickly look at clarifying a legal descent class. And so we're going to just look at tightening up American descendant of slavery and descendant of American chattel slavery. And so one of the things that's pretty loose and that needs to be tightened is that understanding of American. And so one of the things that you might want to think about is clarifying that and actually specifying United States of America to let it be known that that is what you're talking about. That's the American and the America that you are talking about. And you're also talking about lineal descent of victims of colonial and or United States of America slavery and or black codes or United States of America Jim Crow. And yes, indeed, it's a very involved sort of definition. But when you're talking about creating a legal class, you're going to have to be that specific because you're going to have to be very clear about who is included and who is excluded in that particular class. And so it's very important to say that you're talking about United States of America, lineal descendants of victims of colonial and or United States of America slavery and or black codes or United States of America Jim Crow. The reason why you want to do this is because you are trying to include all of the victims of this particular situation because you're talking about an apartheid situation also. And so you want to make sure that you include all of these potential heirs to this situation. And you do want to clarify that you are talking about victims of both colonial and or United States of America slavery, because you have to remember that slavery did not start with the United States and slavery actually did not extend that long in terms of time after the United States turned into its own country. And so you do need to capture that colonial time. You also need to capture those individuals who were victims of the black codes. You also need to capture those who were victimized by the sanctioning of Jim Crow. And so if you're tightening up your definition, again, you don't have to necessarily change from ADOS or DACS to anything else, but there just needs to be a tightening in terms of the legal understanding of what you're talking about. Okay, so you need to specify that you're talking about ancestral lineal descent from a victim that was born in the United States of America prior to 1942 at least. And you want to make sure that you clarify who the original victim was. What was the demographic of the original victim? And so in this instance, you would want to clarify original victim classified as Black, Negro, Colored, African American, Afro American, Black American, Indian, Creole, Mulatto, however you're going to tighten that. And I'm just going to say this before people start putting comments in the comment section. Any comments disparaging any group, any demographic group, racial group, ethnic group, religious group, your comment is going to be deleted and you are going to be blocked. Okay, so let's continue on here. Okay, so claim holder, you need to clarify who the claim holder is. And this should be related not just to how they've been identifying for the past 10 years, because you don't know when or if this reparation is going to occur. And so you want to trace that back to birth. So how were they classified at birth? What's on that birth certificate? Were they classified as Black, Negro, Colored, African American, Afro American, Black American, Indian, Creole, Mulatto? So you want to know that because those are all of the different ancestries, all of the different ethnic groups that might be potential heirs in the situation. And you also may have individuals who don't have that classification, and you need to start thinking about that also. And we're going to talk about that. There's a particular ancestry video that we're going to do that's going to clarify some things about how people got the last names that they have. A lot of people believe that they have the last names that they have because these were their slave owner names, and that is erroneous for many people. For many people, those are your names. If you have a Scottish last name, that's your last name. And for many people, you have that Irish last name, that's your last name, and that last name came from your ancestors. And it had nothing to do, in many instances, with a great-great-great-grandmother being assaulted. And so just so that you start to get prepared for that discussion, because it's a very important discussion, and you need to keep your mind open regarding that. And you also may have individuals who do not trace back to a specific slavery instance. And so that's why Black codes and Jim Crow need to be included, because that was the bulk of harm that occurred after slavery, and it was significant in terms of land loss, in terms of economic loss, in terms of crimes against person. There were lots of human rights violations that took place not that long ago. Okay, so you need to just keep your mind open to a number of issues here. And so some of the things you might want to also think about is looking at the original victim and making sure perhaps to include or exclude those individuals who were tribal members that had sovereign treaty status as Native American nations or tribes. Some individuals belong to, those 5 civilized tribes. And so you might want to exclude individuals who have already received reparations, in other words. And so you have Indian tribes who have not received reparations. You call those Black Indian tribes, Southeast, Northeast woodland tribes. They have never received reparations. They've been treated as Black, Negro, Colored, African American, Indian, Creole, Mulatto. However, they have never received formal reparations. And so you might want to think about how you want to include and exclude in terms of that. And the other thing is that you might want to include or exclude very specifically non-treaty status Indians whose lineal descent, that ancestor was classified as Black, Negro, Colored, or Mulatto. And so you might want to make that a clarification in terms of that Indian status. And so you definitely do not want to erroneously exclude someone because they are identified as Indian when in prior times that ancestor was identified as Black, Negro, Colored, or Mulatto. Okay, so you also will want to exclude those individuals who were trying to use DNA testing to make that ancestry claim, simply because the DNA testing is not going to tell you exactly who your ancestors are. The commercial DNA testing tells you who you are related to. It can tell you that. in some instances. Okay, but it's really for entertainment purposes. But what it can't do is tell you specifically who your ancestors are, because your ancestors have not taken the test. And so there's no comparison group. And in many instances, they can't even compare you to other Indian groups or other African groups or European groups if those individuals have not been tested. So if they don't have those samples available, they cannot make those connections. They actually have to have the samples available. And so to summarize this tightening, you need to clarify what type of American you are talking about. You need to clarify the type of victim that you are talking about. You need to clarify the type of victimization that you're talking about. So you're talking about slavery, you're talking about black codes, you're talking about Jim Crow. You need to clarify the demographic for the potential claim holder. You need to clarify who specifically is going to be excluded and included in terms of Indian status. And you can see on the screen additional families that were in the boot heel, sharecropping families that were out on the road. And one thing you might note is that the woman who is closest has very stereotypical American Indian phenotype dynamics going on. Now, that's not to suggest that there's one way to look like an Indian, but she definitely has very stereotypical features. Okay, so let's clarify this idea of reparations. One thing I want to mention is that in some conversations, people are talking about, quote unquote, reparations as the black agenda. You can use that terminology. However, it's going to be problematic for a number of legal reasons, and we can get into that in another video. You really need to keep it strictly to the class that you're talking about. And so when you are anything that you're writing about it, you need to stick with language related to the class. And so if you kind of jump off and start talking about, you know, this is what's going on with black people in general, or this is what's going on with African Americans or impoverished people, you really can't do that. You need to keep that definition and that understanding pretty tight. So what reparations is about, it's about the balancing act. As a matter of fact, that would be a good title for a piece of legislation for reparations, the balancing act. And so what reparations is really about is about restoration. It's about restoring someone to the place that they would have been had not the harm occurred. And so it's talking about restitution. It's about paying back, compensating. It's compensatory justice. It's in this particular situation, we're talking about equal protection remediation. And so there was a failure. When you think about a country is a sovereign. And a country has what's known in the United States, has what's known as parens patriae duty. This means father of the country. And so the way the government is supposed to operate is they're supposed to operate based upon a social contract. The social contract basically says this: we give up our rights in exchange for protection. We give up our rights in exchange for care. And so it's a balancing act, and it's a relationship. And somewhere along the line, this paternalistic relationship broke down. And what the United States government did was it treated some of its children as stepchildren, not even stepchildren, children who were not even their children, and then played favorites with other children. So this is a way to humanize this whole dynamic here. And so in some instances, and you can see the people who were out on the road, those people who were out on the road, in many instances, there were government subsidies provided in terms of food, and people got food based upon skin color. And so those who had lighter skin color, they got food first, and whatever was left over, the other children with the darker skin, they got that food. And so you can see how inappropriate this is in terms of a parental relationship. And so you also had instances where they gave the money that was supposed to go to all of the children to the children with lighter skin. And the children with lighter skin then decided that they were not going to give their share to the children with darker skin. And in some instances, there were children with lighter skin that they did not give their fair share to. And so you've got a situation where you've got a parental sort of failure. Okay. And so when you're talking to these potential candidates for office, you might want to start thinking about terming things in that way. What are you going to do for the children that you forgot? What are you going to do for the children that you didn't give a snack to when you gave a snack to the other children? What are you going to do for the children that you didn't house when you housed the other children? And so that's just another way to conceptualize this. Reparations is not a handout. People talk as if it's a handout. It's unclear about where that comes from. For some people who are doing that, they want to tell themselves, they believe in this meritocracy. So they want to tell themselves that everything they've done it by pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. Nobody does anything in isolation. People can't even get to work without traveling the roads that were created by all of the people. And so there is none of this pulled self up completely by bootstraps. And you also have individuals who are now living based upon this unfair advantage that was given based upon things not being distributed the way they should have been distributed based upon law and based upon morality. And so reparations is simply to place the harmed person or their descendants, whoever's standing in their shoes, to place them in the position that they would have been in had the harm not occurred. And so had compensation not been provided, a person would be in a particular situation, but if the compensation had been provided, then a person would be in another situation and their children would be in another situation. Had the parent of the country provided equal protection to all of the children would be on more equal footing, or they would be treated and experiencing citizenship in a different way. They would be experiencing making America great again in a different way. They would be experiencing the American dream in another way. And some people, talk about, how reparations should be provided based upon what they think somebody else is going to do with their reparations, whatever that reparations might look like. It's really no one else's business what someone does with their restoration. It's just like, you don't concern yourself with how a father takes care of his family. You don't concern yourself with how another mother takes care of her family. What someone is going to do with reparations, whatever that might be, is really no one else's business. But one important thing to remember is that when you are talking about that class, that legal class, and you're talking about reparations, you need to very clearly tie the reparations to the harm that has occurred. And so sometimes people, kind of be all out, coming up with all sorts of fancy ideas about what should and should not happen, but you want to keep it as tight as possible. And so if you go back in history and you see a particular harm, an injustice that was done, you want reparations related to that particular injustice. And so you can make it cumulative, but it needs to be tied to a particular type of injustice. And so you just want to think about that in terms of tightening things up and in terms of creating this balanced situation. And so just to sort of sum this up, just remember that reparations is about repair. That's the word. It's about repair, something or someone that was broken. And you can see more families in the boot heel out on the road in the 30s. And so this should also give you some sort of idea of the harm that was done and potential repair. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.